This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. The terrible fires we've had in the last few years make climate change pretty undeniable. Still, oil and gas companies do not want to admit that their drilling practices with antiquated permits are contributing to greenhouse gases and other pollution. It is heartening to know that there are folks out there who are watching companies who put profit over people while they create pollution of the air and earth and potentially our fresh water. My guest today is Merrill Berge, a woman who is a defender of our precious Ventura County agricultural land and water. Merrill is the president of CFROG, an acronym for Climate First, Replacing Oil and Gas, a nonprofit watchdog of oil and gas companies. She has chalked up a lot of experience in grassroots activism. Merrill has served on the SOAR board, and that is an acronym for Save Our Open Spaces and Resources, and has also been on the board for Ventura County Resource Conservation District for the past 8 years. We're so happy to have you here today, Merrill.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen.
So you told me that besides your work to protect our agriculture, open spaces, and natural resources, you're also a landscaper. Now, how does working with the natural world, in other words, plants and soil, keep you in touch with what is happening in Ventura County as we live in drought conditions and alarming illustrations of climate change, such as the before mentioned increased and more intense wildfires?
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. That is such a great question because it can go on and on and on, but I will give you kind of the short answer.
Okay.
In that in my time in the landscaping business, the last 20 years, it has been the front row seat on what is evolving in our natural world. So as you mentioned, water is a huge issue as we head into the imported water cutbacks, which then mean that our groundwater locally becomes increasingly more precious. And how do we adapt our landscapes so that they are still aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time are responsible? And the other issue for landscaping is what's called hardening your home or adapting your landscape. As you can see from that Laguna Niguel, Orange County fire, that those, even if you have a great big house with all sorts of irrigation, if there's a fire coming through, you are in danger. Your house is in danger. And so the most important thing going forward now in the landscaping business is getting things away from the house, planting away from the house so that those shrubs that have dry, twiggy undergrowth in them, which are flame throwers, spark setters, aren't right next to your house. So it's been an interesting intersection of my climate work with my landscape work, and one informs the other.
Okay, so when we talked earlier, we talked about how the paradigm in landscaping changed since you began working in the field, so to speak.
Yeah, it is so important. And luckily enough, I work with the Ventura County Resource Conservation District Board. There are lots of classes and lots of seminars now being offered by CAL FIRE and all of the agencies to help you balance what you would like in your yard for landscaping and what would be best in terms of protecting your house from wildfires.
Right, and you also mentioned it used to be lawns and roses, and what is it now?
So now it's more succulents, of course,
Uh-huh.
but you can mix succulents in with other things, still roses, but you just have a drip irrigation system that
Oh,
only waters the roses. So I think
right.
one of the most beautiful combinations are those great big agaves that interspersed with white iceberg roses. I think it's just
Oh,
a really dramatic look.
that
And
sounds wonderful.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So you just do less of the roses and more of the agaves.
Okay, so we can still have beauty and be water conservation wise. Okay, so before joining Seafrog, you worked on several activism projects since 2013, which have given you insight into Ventura County's agriculture and water situation and its relationship to oil drilling. One activism project involved a proposed housing/commercial development near the Conejo Grade. So, what was the deal with the proposed housing development on 750 acres of farmland? Why did you want to save this farmland?
So Kathleen, the biggest reason I wanted to save the farmland is this is the view that we all see as we're coming down the Conejo Grade
Ah,
into Ventura County.
right.
And it's that spot of farmland between the bottom of the grade, Camarillo Springs, and Pleasant Valley Road. And that is 750 acres of prime farmland that was proposed in 2010 for 2,500 homes and 100 acres of industrial development. And the most important thing, especially back then in 2010, there weren't city websites. It was hard to get a feel from an article in the newspaper about how big and where and what this was, what this would mean, especially for traffic in particular on the 101 freeway, in addition to the farmland. So I decided the most important thing for me was to get educated, up to speed, knowledgeable, know the facts, and then start to tell people.
Uh-huh.
So I ended up with a little table down at the farmer's market, or Camarillo Farmer's Market, and began helping people understand where this was, how big it was going to be. And then I tapped into a concern by so many residents about losing our farmland and the traffic on the 101. And so I just naturally created a wonderful network of concerned residents who fortunately showed up at every hearing, every time, and filled every seat. So the city council pulled the plug on the project in 2014. Then I had my wonderful Camarillo Sustainable Growth Group of network, which has been a great source of support for various projects. But that was my mantra from the beginning, or my MO, as they say, is to get fully informed so that you can help people understand the situation and explain it to them factually, correctly, so they have the facts at hand to speak themselves.
Okay, and so that's how you work. And I just want to mention, I just so appreciate your saving that view, because I remember, maybe 30 years ago, we were briefly living in Arizona and we drove across the desert through LA. We are going up to Ventura, Santa Barbara, and it was just like, oh my God, when we came across that grade and you could see the ocean. So thank you for saving. Another project that you work on was the solar. And we just have to have you give us a little brief thing on that so we have time for all the many questions I have you. So
SOAR, that project in a sense rolled over to SOAR, the renewal of SOAR. So in Ventura County, SOAR, which stands for Save Open Space and Agricultural Resources, had actually been approved by Ventura County residents in the late 1990s. But it needed to be renewed.
Oh.
And so we had a renewal campaign for the presidential election of 2016. And this is a wonderful, unique to Ventura County, a way for the community to weigh in when a housing development project, when a development project expands beyond basically the city limit boundaries. So within the city limits, the city council still is able to determine the whether a housing development is to proceed or not. But if it expands, and basically we were addressing sprawl, housing sprawl into our open spaces and farmlands. So if it expands and the housing and the development is approved, then it ultimately goes to the community for an up or down vote, simple majority, as to whether or not it should be approved or not by the community.
Okay, well, thank you for doing that as well. So the mission of CFROG is to replace oil and gas. Now, how do you work toward both? Act as a watchdog and work to replace fossil fuels. And while you're telling your listener, tell it what types of fuels you want to be used to replace those fossil fuels.
So CFROG started as a small group. Again, I love grassroots local organizations. And this was a small group of a former high school principal, a former journalist, a scientist that lived up in Ojai, and there was a project in their backyard. And they too dove into the details and found out that there was a glaring error that needed to be addressed that wasn't being addressed. And they brought it to the planning department and planning commission's attention. So CFROG started out as Climate First, replacing, this is what it is now, Climate First, it's Citizens for Responsible Oil and Gas. And this, we got known by that acronym, CFROG. So we wanted to keep that. And so we switched it to Climate First, because that's the imperative for us going forward. And replacing oil and gas was merely a transitional term in a sense. We need to, as you say, move on to renewables. We're so lucky to have the Clean Power Alliance that most of the communities have now committed to, so that our energy sources are renewable sources. And in fact, 83% of California's energy is now being supplied by renewable solar, wind, geothermal sources. So this is when we talk about replacing, it's a transition, and it's really, really important to us that the jobs and the employment becomes transitioned as well. And there is so much to be done on the remediation side of that transition as the oil industry declines of a natural evolution, as electric cars come on, as we move away from the climate warming fossil fuel emissions, that there will then be all sorts of necessary jobs for those with oil production background to help clean up the oil infrastructure that will be left. So this is a really important and necessary, and I think will be a fantastic source of employment for the oil industry going forward.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, we need to clean up what was done. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't think about that. Yeah. What does the activism of CFROG look like? I mean, what does your organization do? You already mentioned you educate yourselves, but who are the people who do it? Is the nonprofit mainly composed of volunteers?
Yeah, we have grown. So we now have an executive director and a program manager, really just two paid staff. And we all, though a very active board, dive into the details. And again, as a watchdog organization, what we do is when things are going through the planning staff, planning process, I should say, we evaluate what are their impacts, where are they, how big will they be, and what does this mean in the overall picture. So unfortunately, again, we have a wonderful group, larger and larger now, group of supporters who help us, as they say, amplify that information. So people can understand and be aware of what is evolving in their backyards, in their communities.
And, does Sea Frog advocate a full transition from fossil fuels? But we're unable to fully make that transition right now to renewable energy. Why can't we do it right now? And why do fossil fuels eventually have to go?
Well, and that's my other, in a sense, personal value. It's about balance. And it's really important that we move forward for the generations to come. I just listened to a water board water presentation. The Cayugas Municipal Water importer gave a board of supervisors presentation, and the snowpack is increasingly low. The rainfall is increasingly less. And when it does come, it's more extreme. It's really important that we make that connection to why this is happening. And it is being exacerbated by all the carbon in the air. Carbon comes from fossil fuel production. So that's why it is incredibly important that we reduce the need for fossil fuels. It won't happen overnight, but it is incredibly and increasingly immediately important, what with all of the reports and studies showing how quickly things are warming, how quickly ecosystems are being affected, and how that will impact our world going forward.
Okay, so we have to stop here for a second and take a station ID. This is KPPQ LP Ventura 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Merrill Berge, a woman who is a defender of our precious Ventura County agricultural land and water. Merrill is the president of Sea Frog, an acronym for Climate First, Replacing Oil and Gas, a nonprofit watchdog of oil and gas companies. And we'll be talking about measures A and B on the ballot in June. These measures are directly related to the work Merrill does with Sea Frog, so stay tuned. Okay, and we're back. Inform your listener about the Oxnard Plain. Now, how did you combat the pollution taking place in Oxnard by gas and oil companies that were polluting the area with their method of extraction? And what was that method of extraction?
I think it's really important to point out that this is an ongoing effort. And it's so important that we all work together. That is the, I tell my kids when they are anxious about their future, that this is a time of opportunity. This is a time when people will be searching for better alternatives, for new ways to doing things, that this can be seen as a wonderful leap forward. So on the Oxnard Plain was a project. I come to find out underneath the Oxnard Plain, to begin with, is a deposit, large deposit of tar sands. So tar sands are thick. They're like peanut butter. They're carbon intensive. They're what asphalt is made out of. So in order to get the tar sands up, and the Oxnard Plain is layered with aquifers. You have an upper aquifer and you have a lower aquifer, and most importantly, you have what's called the Fox Canyon aquifer underneath. And so this project was drilling down through the aquifers with a high steam mixed with a chemical concoction to loosen the tar sand down below, high temperature process to loosen it so that it's viscous enough to get it to move back up. So this is the reason that this type of drilling is of such concern, and especially for local communities, because this is the oil companies will not say what is in their mixtures. They call it proprietary. So we do not know exactly what chemicals are going down. We know they're detergents. We know they're additives. We know and so all of these, when the oil comes back up, there are emissions. We have leaks into the air. we have can impact local communities. There's been studies shown, there's a Stanford study that showed the impacts of asthma in particular, people who live near respiratory issues, gestation, baby gestation, miscarriages, that kind of thing. So this is really another critical factor in the oil extraction process are the health impacts, local communities who surround or near these.
Are you interested as CFROG, and the people who work there in influencing and educating the public, or more interested in influencing and educating policymakers? Are both necessary?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a very synchronistic dynamic. What's wonderful is that people are really hungry for correct information, help understanding what's unfolding, especially right here and right now. So we do both. So we dive into the details, we get the information, we share it with both policymakers and with the community, because the policymakers need the community to push. The policymakers are not going to go out on a limb and do something that the residents the residents need to support these efforts.
Right.
They want to see people saying to them, yes, we need to do this. So it's both are important. You need to help the policy people understand how important it is, and you help people understand how important it is and how important it is to push the policymakers.
Let's talk about the oil wells. How many oil wells are there in Ventura County, and why aren't we aware of how many there are? I was telling somebody about this, and they said, "What? We didn't know there were all those oil wells." So, how many?
So Ventura County has had the oil industry has been here since basically the 1920s. So we have had oil drilling up, especially in our open spaces, out in the farmlands. That area along the Ventura Avenue is an example of one that's been done right in the backyard, and you can see the extent of that. Well, consider up above, as you're going up the coastline, all that area that's up above on the hill and behind. We have had over 6,800 oil wells drilled in Ventura County. That's a combination of what they call active wells, idle wells, and aging in place abandoned wells. So we have a huge inventory of what I call straws, drilling down through 1,000 of them have been drilled down now through and near aquifers on what they call antiquated permits. So this is the issue for Ventura County, is that these old permits issued before 1970 allow any number of wells, any method of drilling, and they never expire.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
They get passed from one oil company to the next when they're sold.
How many, can you give us a number of how many, or at least rounded off number, how many there are?
Yep. So on the antiquated permits, there are approximately 5,000, again, a combination of active, idle, and abandoned wells on the antiquated permits.
So they're not all operating, but
But that's Kathleen, that's really, again, the situation going forward for us as more wells are drilled, and they will be. Measures A and B only apply to new future oil drilling. It will not impact the current oil production, employment, tax revenues. Measures A and B only apply to new future oil drilling. So, but as we add more oil wells to our 6,000 plus inventory, this is why we need those environmental reviews to ascertain how that would impact our county, what they call cumulatively, in total. Where is it going to be drilled? How close to an aquifer? What does that mean in terms of air emissions in this area? That kind of thing. So it just provides data, better decisions, and better conditions. It doesn't stop an oil project. It just allows planning to say, okay, if you're going to drill here, then this is what you need to safeguard our air, water, and communities.
Is it true that some of these oil wells are drilled directly into our millions of years old aquifer, which is our only local source of fresh water?
So what happens is they drill through. So they drill through and they have, casings, they have structures around them. But as we all know, things degrade over time. Things get old.
Right.
Things start to have cracks.
Right.
That's the issue, especially with the abandoned wells. So they become what's called pathways. And that's how they found the thermogenic gases, the petroleum-related gases in the irrigation wells out on the Oxnard Plain near this cyclic steam project that was drilling down to reach the tar sink. So that's, even though they did not determine whether they were naturally occurring or because of the proximity to the oil project. It is an example of how you get cross-contamination. And they did say there should be further studies, which is exactly what Measure A and B would do. So the reason that this is important, why a yes vote on Measure A and B is so important to our county, is that all of the northern communities, Ventura, Ojai, Santa Paula, Fillmore, all of the Heritage Valley, Santa Clara River communities are completely dependent on groundwater sources. They are not connected to any imported water. They're aquifers. This is also the same area that has the majority of oil and gas production. The other reason, and that's approximately 400,000 residents, the other reason that is incredibly important to protect our aquifers is that 85% of the crops grown in Ventura County that support our $2 billion ag economy are irrigated from our local aquifers. This is the clean water is why we have healthy food. Clean water is what comes out of drinking taps, out of water taps in these communities. Right. That's what Measures A and B will help better protect.
There were attempts by Ventura County to correct this problem with antiquated permits that never expire. What did they do?
So they voted on this in November of 2020. And in December, the next month, there was a political action committee created called Working Families for Energy Independence that got $950,000 from ERA Energy. And immediately on the streets were paid petition gatherers to collect signatures to put this decision on the ballot in June, which actually is now, the election day is June 7th.
And Measures A and B are directly related to all we've talked about. So why should your listener care about Measures A and B?
I think that this is a critical point in Ventura County's future, because again, if the no vote wins, this two-tiered permitting process with these antiquated permits that cover 127,000 acres in Ventura County that allow any number of wells, any method of drilling without any environmental review, and never expire, will never expire. The reason that the oil industry is investing is because they're looking for a return on their investment. Ventura County will become the easy, lucrative place for them to drill. As they're getting pushed out of LA County, these antiquated permits are an unbelievable loophole in our permitting system, gives them basically open season. Ventura County would become the place to drill for oil because it would be easy, more lucrative. It's still profitable, even because these new permits, quote unquote, are since the 1970s. So since the 1970s, the oil industry has certainly been profitable and productive.
Okay, so we're going to have to wrap up very soon here, but what does a yes vote mean and what does a no vote mean?
So a yes vote will simply have the old permits be consistent and the same as the new oil permits with an environmental review before the oil well is drilled. And the no vote will again keep this two-tiered permitting process with the antiquated permits that allow any number of wells, any type of drilling, and never expire, That's what would stay in place in Ventura County.
We're running out of time here, but thank you so much, Merrill Berge, president of Sea Frog, for coming in to tell us about Sea Frog, which is a nonprofit working to protect Ventura County from oil and gas pollution. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.